Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Thanksgiving at my mother's house had always followed the same predictable script, a carefully rehearsed performance where my brother, Mark, took center stage, basking in the warmth of endless praise while I was expected to smile, nod, and accept whatever patronizing remarks were thrown my way. The house smelled like roasted turkey and buttered rolls, the air thick with the kind of forced cheerfulness that only existed in families that spent more time pretending to be close than actually being close. I had spent years sitting at this table, listening to the same conversations, the same backhanded compliments, the same dismissive tone whenever the topic of my life came up. Mark, as usual, was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, the man my mother spoke about with the kind of reverence reserved for saints and war heroes. He sat at the head of the table, leaning back comfortably, one arm draped over the chair next to him, smirking in that effortless way that came so naturally to him, the way he always did when he knew the room belonged to him. And of course, my mother gushed, her voice dripping with pride, her eyes shining with admiration. Mark just bought the most beautiful house. For bedrooms, a gorgeous kitchen, and oh, the backyard is just stunning. It's the kind of home where you can really see a future, a real investment, something that just makes sense, you know? I knew exactly what was coming before she even turned to me, her eyes filled with that same expectant look, that same gentle condescension, that same unspoken comparison she had been making my entire life. But Lena, sweetheart, she said, tilting her head slightly, her lips curving into a sympathetic smile, when are you finally going to settle down? For a moment, the room was silent, the question hanging in the air, waiting for me to respond the way I always did, with a forced laugh, a vague answer, an attempt to smooth over the blatant favoritism as if it didn't sting, as if I hadn't spent years swallowing the bitter taste of being second best. But this time, I was done playing along. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the warmth settle in my chest, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough to make my mother shift slightly in her seat, just long enough to see Mark's smirk deepen, as if he was already preparing to hear me fumble through another excuse. Then, I set my glass down carefully, looking directly at my mother, my voice calm, steady, and sharp enough to slice through the artificial warmth of the room. "Oh," I said with a small, knowing smile. "I already did. I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." The sound of my mother's fork clattering against her plate echoed through the sudden, deafening silence, the quiet gasp from my aunt barely audible over the collective intake of breath around the table. My mother's lips parted slightly, her eyes widening, confusion flickering across her face as she struggled to process my words, as if the very idea of me having a life she wasn't aware of, a life she hadn't approved of, was impossible to comprehend. Mark, for the first time in his life, actually looked unsettled, his smirk faltering, his fingers tightening slightly around his glass, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether this was some kind of joke. "You what?" My mother finally stammered, her voice thinner now, no longer carrying that effortless certainty she always had when speaking about Mark. "What do you mean you settled down? You didn't tell us anything about." "Exactly," I said smoothly, taking another sip of wine, watching as the realization started to creep in, as the whispers started spreading down the table, as the carefully crafted illusion of our family's perfect balance began to crack, piece by piece. My mother's gaze darted toward Mark as if looking for reassurance, as if expecting him to smirk and roll his eyes and dismiss my words as some kind of sarcastic remark. But Mark didn't say a word, his jaw tightening slightly, his fingers tapping idly against the table, his confidence shaken just enough for me to see it, just enough for me to enjoy it. "Lena," my mother said again, her voice more cautious now, her eyes searching mine for some kind of answer that would make sense to her, something that would put things back into the neat little boxes she had arranged in her mind. "What exactly do you mean by that?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, savoring the moment, savoring the way the power had shifted in the room, savoring the way they all leaned in slightly, waiting, expecting me to explain myself, to justify myself. To give them the details they suddenly seemed so desperate to know. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for the mashed potatoes, casually spooning some onto my plate, completely unfazed by the silence, by the eyes burning into me, by the fact that for the first time in my life, I had taken the attention away from Mark without even trying. And as I took a bite, as I chewed slowly, as I let the moment stretch just a little longer, I saw it, the first crack in my mother's certainty, the first hint of doubt in Mark's eyes, the first time in years that the conversation wasn't revolving around him. I swallowed, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and then, finally, I met my mother's gaze with a look that said everything I didn't need to say out loud. "You always assumed I was behind," I said, my voice soft but firm, my words sinking into the heavy air between us like stones in water. "You just never bothered to ask where I was going." Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating silence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the afterthought sitting in the shadow of the sun she had always put on a pedestal. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had one. The silence in the dining room stretched longer than I expected, the weight of my words settling over the table like an unexpected storm cloud, lingering in the space where my mother's effortless confidence used to be. For years, she had spoken about Mark with a certainty that bordered on worship, a belief so deeply ingrained that she never stopped to consider the possibility that I had been doing just fine on my own. I could see it in the way she blinked rapidly, her fingers clutching her napkin, her mouth slightly open as if trying to find a way to steer the conversation back to something she could control. Mark shifted in his seat, the flicker of unease behind his smirk barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime studying him. He had always been so sure of his place in this family, so secure in the knowledge that he was the successful one, the one who mattered, the one our mother would always put first. But now, for the first time, I had taken something from him, attention, control, the power to dictate the narrative, and I could feel the frustration radiating off him like heat. "So, Lena," my Aunt Carol finally said, breaking the tension with a forced lightness that did nothing to mask the curiosity in her voice, "where exactly is this house of yours?" I took my time chewing my food, setting my fork down carefully, letting my gaze sweep across the table, watching as the interest in my life, for once, outweighed the usual dismissiveness. It was almost amusing how little they knew about me, how little effort they had ever made to ask real questions about my choices, my plans, my success. They had spent so much time assuming I was floundering that it had never occurred to them that I might actually be ahead. "Oh, I said casually, reaching for my wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid slowly before taking a small sip. "Not too far from here. About 20 minutes or so, depending on traffic." That answer was deliberately vague, just enough to keep them wondering, just enough to make them itch for more details, just enough to let the power continue shifting in my favor. My mother cleared her throat, regaining just enough composure to attempt to mask her irritation, but I could see the way her grip on her fork had tightened, the way her shoulders had tensed slightly. "How long have you had it?" she asked, her tone even but laced with the kind of forced politeness she reserved for people she didn't particularly respect. I shrugged, leaning back slightly in my chair, enjoying the way the entire table was hanging onto my words now, waiting, expecting, desperate to fill in the gaps of a story they had never bothered to ask about before. "Almost a year," I said, pretending not to notice the way my mother's expression twitched, the way Mark's smirk vanished for just a fraction of a second before he covered it up with another sip of his drink. "A year. An entire year of owning my own home, of making my own decisions, of living a life separate from their expectations, and they had never known." It was almost laughable, how easy it had been to keep it from them, how little effort it took to build something for myself without ever feeling the need to seek their approval. "Why didn't you say anything?" my mother asked, and this time, the strain in her voice was undeniable, the realization creeping in that she had been left out, that she had not been part of something important, that she had failed to see something she had always assumed she controlled. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think about it, pretending that this wasn't the moment I had been waiting for, pretending that her question hadn't already been answered a long time ago. I guess it just never came up, I said, keeping my voice light, letting the words linger, watching as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't make her look as out of touch as she clearly felt. Mark let out a short laugh, shaking his head, leaning back in his chair with the same forced confidence he always relied on when he felt threatened. "Come on, Lena," he said, smirking just enough to make it clear he was trying to regain some ground. "A house is a pretty big deal. Kind of weird to keep something like that a secret, don't you think?" I met his gaze steadily, letting him see that I wasn't intimidated, that I wasn't going to shrink under his scrutiny the way I had in the past, that whatever power he thought he had over me was slipping through his fingers faster than he realized. "Not really," I said, lifting my glass again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable, just long enough for the weight of my words to settle. "I mean, it's not like anyone ever asked." The subtle jab landed exactly where I wanted it to, my mother's lips pressing into a thin line, my aunt shifting awkwardly in her seat, Mark's smirk faltering just enough for me to see the frustration beneath it. They had never asked, never cared to check, never once considered that I might be building something for myself while they were too busy focusing on Mark's every move. "Well," Mark said after a long pause, regaining just enough composure to attempt another shot, his smirk returning, his voice dripping with that same smugness he had always used to remind me of his supposed superiority. "What kind of place did you even buy?" I could see what he was trying to do, trying to diminish whatever I had achieved before he even knew the details, trying to belittle my success before I had the chance to fully reveal it. He was desperate now, trying to grasp onto any last shred of control he had, trying to make sure he was still the one on top. I smiled, slow and deliberate, setting my glass down carefully before looking him directly in the eye. "Oh," I said, my voice effortlessly calm, my words landing with the force of a final, undeniable truth, "It's bigger than yours." The stunned silence that followed was even more satisfying than I had imagined. Mark's smirk twitched at the corners, his confidence wavering just slightly, his fingers tightening around his glass as if he needed something to hold on to, something solid to anchor him in the suddenly shifting conversation. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of attention, wasn't the unquestioned star of the evening, wasn't the one basking in our mother's relentless praise while I was left to sit quietly in the background. And judging by the tension in his jaw, he didn't like it. The silence that followed my last words hung over the table, thick and suffocating, stretching long enough for the weight of them to fully sink in. My mother blinked rapidly, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but for once, there was nothing she could offer to immediately dismiss or downplay what I had just said. "Bigger?" my Aunt Carol finally asked, her brows raising slightly, her curiosity now overtaking her usual indifference. "Well, how big are we talking here, Lena?" I could feel Mark's eyes burning into me, his smirk now nothing more than a strained line, his fingers tapping impatiently against the table, his irritation barely contained beneath his thinly veiled composure. He had spent his whole life being the one with the most impressive achievements, the most praiseworthy milestones, the one everyone in the family admired. But now, that certainty had been shaken, and he hated it. I leaned back slightly, letting my fingers graze the stem of my wine glass, taking my time before answering, enjoying the way the power had so effortlessly shifted in my favor. "Just over 4,000 square feet, I said lightly, my tone casual, almost uninterested, as if the number didn't carry any weight at all. Mark's expression barely flickered, but I caught it, the slight widening of his eyes, the way his grip on his glass tightened just a little more, the way his smirk struggled to stay in place. 4,000? My cousin Lisa repeated, her voice somewhere between impressed and disbelieving. That's huge, Lena." My mother inhaled sharply, blinking as if trying to process the information, trying to reconcile it with the version of me she had always carried in her mind, the version that needed guidance, that needed concern. That wasn't quite as accomplished or successful as Mark. "But, sweetheart," she said finally, forcing a thin smile, her voice just a little too tight, "don't you think that's a bit much for someone on their own?" And there it was. I could almost hear the desperate attempt to regain control in her voice, the subtle, almost instinctive effort to turn my success into something that required justification, something that needed to be explained, something that couldn't just be accepted at face value. I let the question sit for a moment, watching her, watching Mark, watching the way their carefully crafted perceptions of me were crumbling, piece by piece. "Not really," I said finally, my voice even, unwavering, perfectly calm. "I mean, I didn't take out a mortgage or anything, so it's not like I have to worry about it being a financial strain." The reaction was instant. Mark's glass hit the table a little harder than necessary, his knuckles white against the glass, his entire body stiffening as if I had just slapped him across the face. My mother's mouth fell open slightly, her carefully maintained expression cracking just enough for me to see the genuine shock beneath it. She started, her voice faltering for the first time all night. "You paid for it, in full?" I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider my answer, even though I already knew the impact of what I had just revealed, even though I had been waiting for this moment, even though I had imagined this exact reaction 1,000 times before. "Yeah," I said, my tone light, my smile unbothered, my posture completely relaxed. "I mean, it just made sense. No debt, no loans, no worrying about interest rates. Just mine." The weight of my words settled heavily across the table, thick and undeniable, shifting the energy of the entire room in an instant. Mark's face had gone pale, his smirk long gone, his confidence visibly unraveling in real time. He had spent his entire life being the golden boy, the one with the most to brag about, the one our mother doted on endlessly, the one who had always been one step ahead. And yet, here I was, calmly revealing that I had surpassed him without even trying, without seeking validation, without needing anyone's approval. "So," I said, letting my gaze drift toward him, watching as he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, "How's your mortgage, Mark?" His jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something dangerously close to resentment, his fingers gripping the edges of his plate like he was trying to keep himself from snapping. My mother cleared her throat, trying desperately to salvage the conversation, to redirect the attention back to Mark, to rebuild the image that had just shattered in front of everyone. "Well, Mark's home is absolutely lovely," she said quickly, her smile forced, her voice a little too bright, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. "And it's in such a wonderful neighborhood, such a smart investment." Mark exhaled sharply, straightening in his chair, forcing a tight smile back onto his face, clearly relieved by the save. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little stiff, his confidence not quite as effortless as before. "And real estate is all about timing. The market's been tricky, but I got a great deal." Aunt Carol raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly, clearly intrigued by the sudden shift in Mark's demeanor. "Wait," she said, setting her fork down, "you didn't pay for your house in full?" The question landed hard, the sudden change in conversation knocking Mark off balance once again. He hesitated, barely a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. "Well, no," he admitted, shifting in his seat, his fingers tightening around his napkin. "I mean, most people don't, right? That's not really how it works." I let out a soft hum, nodding slowly, pretending to consider his words, even though I already knew the truth, even though I had already won. "That's fair," I said, my voice light, unbothered. "I guess some of us just prefer not to owe anyone anything." Mark didn't respond, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable, his hands still gripping the table as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. And for the first time in my life, I watched as the golden boy cracked. The tension in the dining room had shifted from awkward curiosity to something sharper, something more unsettled, something teetering on the edge of collapse. Mark still sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers wrapped too tightly around his napkin, his jaw locked in a way that told me he was trying to hold his composure, but the cracks were already starting to show. My mother, sitting beside him, was clearly desperate to regain control of the conversation, but every attempt she made to steer things back toward his supposed success had fallen flat. I had spent my entire life sitting at this table, listening to her brag about him as if his accomplishments somehow validated her existence, as if his every success was proof that she had raised the perfect son, the one who had done everything right, the one who had never disappointed her. And I had spent just as many years biting my tongue, letting the comparisons roll off my back, pretending that it didn't matter when she glossed over my achievements, when she treated me like an afterthought, when she made it clear that I would never measure up to the image she had built of him. But tonight, that image was starting to crumble, and I wasn't about to stop it. "You know," I said, tapping my fingers lightly against the table, keeping my voice even, keeping my expression carefully composed. "It's funny how much people assume about you when they don't actually bother to ask." My mother exhaled sharply, her shoulders stiffening, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. "Oh, come on, Lena," she said, forcing a strained chuckle, shaking her head as if she could dismiss everything I had just said, as if she could smooth over the undeniable fact that for the first time in years, Mark wasn't the center of attention. "It's not like we ignore you," I let out a short, humorless laugh, cutting her off with nothing more than the slight tilt of my head, watching as she faltered, as she realized too late that her usual deflections wouldn't work this time. "Really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, my voice dripping with something too sharp to be mistaken for anything other than truth. "When was the last time you asked me about my career? When was the last time you asked about my finances, my goals, my plans, my future?" The silence that followed was loud enough to drown out the soft clinking of silverware against plates, loud enough to press against the edges of the perfectly curated reality my mother had spent years maintaining. "You never asked," I continued, my voice softer now, but no less firm, no less sure, no less filled with the quiet confidence I had spent years building without her approval. "Because you never thought you had to. You assumed Mark was the only one worth bragging about, the only one with a future, the only one who deserved the spotlight. So I stopped trying to impress you. I stopped waiting for your validation. And I made something for myself without ever needing you to notice." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again, her fingers twitching slightly where they rested against the table, her expression torn between defensiveness and something dangerously close to realization. Mark let out a sharp breath, his smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Okay, Lena," he said, his voice too smooth, too forced, too controlled for someone who wasn't feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "We get it. You bought a house. You did well for yourself. Congratulations. Do you want a medal?" I turned my gaze to him slowly, watching as he shifted, as he rolled his shoulders, as he tried, desperately, to regain the power he had always held over me. "No," I said, my voice calm, unbothered. "But maybe you should think about getting some financial advice before you keep running your mouth." His smirk twitched. "Excuse me?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, tilting my head just enough to let him know that I wasn't playing, that I wasn't just throwing words around to get a reaction, that I had something he didn't want me to say out loud. "You like to talk about your success," I said, watching the flicker of discomfort in his eyes, watching as his fingers curled just slightly against the table. "You like to act like you're the one who has it all figured out. But the truth is, Mark, you didn't really buy your house, did you?" The blood drained from his face so fast that for a moment, I thought he might actually be sick. The entire table had gone still, every set of eyes darting between me and Mark, my mother sitting up straighter, her hands clutching the napkin in her lap as if holding onto it would somehow stabilize the conversation. "Lena," she said slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of what I might say next, like she already knew she wouldn't like it. "What are you talking about?" I didn't look away from Mark. "Did you tell her, Mark?" I asked, keeping my voice light, tilting my head slightly. "Did you tell her that you're drowning in debt? Did you tell her that you didn't actually buy that house, that the bank owns most of it, that you maxed out multiple credit cards just to cover the down payment, that you're barely keeping up with your mortgage payments?" My mother gasped, her face going pale, her eyes darting to Mark, searching for reassurance, searching for the version of him she had always believed in. "That's not," Mark started, his voice strangled, his hands clenching into fists against the table. "Not what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, giving him one last chance to admit the truth before I said it for him. Not true? Because I pulled your credit report, Mark. I know exactly how much debt you're carrying. I know exactly how much you owe, how much you're struggling, how much you've been lying to everyone sitting at this table. The silence was deafening. Mark's face twisted with something ugly, something furious, something that he had never directed at me before, something that told me I had hit the one nerve he had never expected me to find. You little, he started, pushing back his chair abruptly, but my mother's sharp intake of breath stopped him. She turned to him slowly, her hands shaking, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disappointment, the kind she had never once directed at him in all the years she had spent believing he could do no wrong. Mark, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but heavy with something final, something undeniable. Tell me that's not true. And for the first time in his life, Mark had no answer. The silence in the dining room stretched long and thick, hanging over the table like a fog that refused to lift, settling deep into every tense muscle, every clenched fist, every wary glance exchanged between the people who had just been forced at a truth they never saw coming. My mother sat rigid in her chair, her fingers curled so tightly around the napkin in her lap that the fabric had twisted into a crumpled mess, her breath uneven, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the words. Mark, on the other hand, looked like a man who had just been backed into a corner, his jaw set so tight I thought his teeth might crack under the pressure, his chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths as he struggled to come up with something, anything, that would make this moment go away. I had spent years watching him manipulate conversations, twist words, redirect attention back onto himself whenever things didn't go his way, and I could tell, even now, that his mind was racing, desperately trying to piece together some excuse that would put him back in control. But the thing about control is that once you lose it, once it slips through your fingers in front of the people who have always believed in you without question, it's nearly impossible to get it back. You're lying, Mark finally said, his voice flat, steady, but carrying the sharp edge of someone who is just a little too desperate to be convincing. You don't know what you're talking about. I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly, watching him, studying the way his fingers twitched against the table, the way his eyes darted briefly toward our mother before settling back on me. He was waiting for her to step in, waiting for her to defend him, waiting for her to do what she had always done, dismiss anything that made him look bad and shift the blame onto someone else. But for once, she didn't. Instead, she turned toward him, her brow furrowed, her voice quiet but laced with something I had never heard directed at him before, uncertainty. Mark, she said, her tone cautious, careful, as if she was afraid of the answer. Tell me she's wrong. Mark let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head quickly, forcing a smirk that barely lasted a second before cracking under the weight of the moment. Mom, come on, he said, waving a hand dismissively, his voice taking on that same patronizing tone he had always used when trying to make himself sound like the rational one. Lena doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just trying to stir up drama. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, my expression calm, steady, unbothered. If I'm lying, I said, keeping my voice light, tilting my head just enough to make him squirm, then why don't you show Mom your bank statements? Your mortgage details? Go ahead, Mark. Prove me wrong. His jaw tightened, his breath hitching for just a fraction of a second, his fingers clenching into fists so tight that his knuckles turned white. And that was all the proof anyone needed. My mother inhaled sharply, her eyes widening, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could physically stop herself from gasping out loud. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, the weight of realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. Mark's entire body stiffened, his fists pressing into the table, his breath coming out in quick, uneven bursts as the truth settled over the room, undeniable, inescapable, suffocating. How much? My mother asked, her voice shaking, her fingers trembling as she turned to face him fully now, no longer looking to me for answers, no longer trying to pretend this was anything other than exactly what it was. How much do you owe? Mark swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route, as if hoping someone, anyone, would come to his rescue. But no one did. Mom, it's not how much. The room fell into an eerie stillness, the weight of her question pressing down on all of us, the tension thick enough to choke on. Mark hesitated, his tongue darting out to wet his lips, his fingers flexing against the table, his entire body screaming reluctance. Then, finally, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "A little over 300,000. The collective inhale around the table was almost deafening. My mother actually reeled back, her hand gripping the edge of the table as if the number had physically knocked the breath from her lungs. 300, she started, but the words got stuck, tangled in her disbelief, her devastation, her humiliation. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his breath uneven, his knee bouncing under the table in barely contained frustration. "It's not as bad as it sounds," he said quickly, his voice laced with thinly veiled desperation, his hands gesturing wildly as if trying to physically swat away the weight of his own failure. "I have a plan. I'm restructuring my finances. It's just temporary." Temporary? My mother's voice was sharp now, slicing through his excuses like a blade, her face flushed with something dangerously close to disgust. "You told me you bought that house outright. You let me tell everyone how successful you were, how well you were doing, and all this time you were drowning in debt?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again, his throat working, his hands shaking slightly as he realized there was no way out of this, no story he could spin, no version of events that could make this disappear. And I just sat there, sipping my wine, watching it all unfold exactly the way I knew it would. "All those years," I murmured, my voice soft but cutting, my eyes locking onto his, watching the flicker of resentment flash behind them, "Mom treated you like you were untouchable, like you were better, smarter, more responsible than me. And all this time, you were barely keeping your head above water while she ignored everything I built for myself." My mother turned toward me then, her mouth opening as if to protest, as if to argue, as if to salvage some version of the truth that would let her keep believing Mark was the son she had always thought he was. But there was nothing left to say. And for the first time in my life, I saw it in her eyes. Doubt. Uncertainty. The realization that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong all along. Mark's chair scraped against the floor as he suddenly stood, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted with anger, his breathing uneven, his entire body radiating rage. And then, just as I expected, he turned that rage toward me. "You think you're better than me?" He snapped, his voice sharp, shaking, his eyes burning with something dark, something venomous. "You think you've won something here?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, tilting my head slightly as I met his furious gaze with nothing but pure, unwavering satisfaction. "I don't think I've won," I said simply, my voice calm, steady, unshaken. "I know I have." Mark's breathing was uneven, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles had turned ghostly white, his jaw locked in a way that made the muscle twitch beneath his skin. He wasn't just angry, he was furious, the kind of rage that boiled over when someone who had spent their entire life on top suddenly found themselves staring up from the bottom. The kind of anger that only came from watching an illusion you built with your own hands shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders rose and fell with each sharp inhale, in the way his fingers twitched like he wanted to grab something, smash something, lash out at someone, anyone, but the only person left to blame was himself. "You just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Mark finally snapped, his voice sharp, strained, dripping with bitterness as he glared at me across the table, his entire body radiating barely restrained fury. "You couldn't let me have one night without turning it into some competition, without trying to make yourself look better at my expense." I let out a soft, amused breath, shaking my head slowly, watching as his face twisted, even further in frustration, his words landing weakly against the sheer force of reality pressing down on him. "I never tried to make myself look better, Mark," I said smoothly, my voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes when you know you've already won. "You did that all on your own." The dining room was silent, save for the sound of my mother's uneasy shifting in her chair, her breath shallow, her hands still clutching the napkin in her lap as if it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. She was staring at Mark now, not with admiration, not with pride, not with the unwavering devotion she had always reserved just for him. No, this time, her expression was something else entirely, something unfamiliar, something cold, something that Mark had never had to face before. Disappointment. He must have seen it too, because his entire face twisted, his hands slamming against the table as he let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the sound brittle and hollow, filled with something dangerously close to desperation. "Are you seriously gonna sit there and look at me like that, Mom?" he demanded, his voice cracking just slightly at the edges, his eyes wide, wild, searching for some last shred of the blind loyalty he had always counted on. "After everything I've done, after everything I've accomplished, you're really gonna act like she's the one you should be proud of?" My mother inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the napkin, her lips pressing into a thin line as she looked at him, as she really looked at him for the first time in years, as she took in the full weight of everything he had been hiding, everything he had been pretending to be, everything he had failed to live up to. "I don't even know who you are," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, but carrying the kind of finality that made Mark flinch like she had physically struck him. Mark took a step back as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs, his face twisting, his entire body stiffening with something dangerously close to panic. "Oh, please," he spat, shaking his head, forcing a sharp, bitter laugh that only made him look more pathetic, more desperate. "Like she's so perfect, right? Like Lena's been waiting her whole life to rub this in my face, to make me look like the failure, to, 'You're the failure,'" I cut in smoothly, watching as he snapped his mouth shut, his face contorting with rage, his hands twitching at his sides. "Not because you struggled, not because you made bad financial decisions, not even because you lied about all of it. No, Mark, you're the failure because you spent your entire life thinking you were better than me, thinking you didn't have to work as hard, thinking that Mom's approval was all you ever needed to be untouchable." Mark's lips parted slightly, his breath uneven, his eyes burning with something close to fear, but I wasn't done. "And guess what?" I continued, tilting my head slightly, my voice soft but sharp, calm but devastating. "She's not proud of you anymore. And she never will be again." The words landed like a hammer, like a wrecking ball, like the final, irreversible crack in the image he had spent his entire life crafting. I could see it in the way his face paled, in the way his breath hitched, in the way his entire body seemed to deflate under the weight of it all. My mother hadn't spoken again, but she didn't have to. The way she looked at him said enough. And that was the moment he knew. It was over. There was no coming back from this. The golden boy wasn't golden anymore. I pushed my chair back slowly, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade, standing up and smoothing my dress as I glanced around the table, taking in the stunned expressions, the shocked silence, the way every single person in the room had realized, in real time, that the entire family narrative had just been rewritten right in front of them. Mark stood there, frozen, humiliated, seething, but powerless to do anything about it. I reached for my purse, slinging it over my shoulder, and took my time making my way toward the door, feeling lighter than I had in years, feeling the weight of their doubt, their dismissal, their constant belittling finally lift off my shoulders. I paused just before stepping out, glancing back at my mother, meeting her gaze one last time, watching as she struggled with the realization that she had never really known me at all. "Next time you ask about my life," I said lightly, my voice dripping with quiet satisfaction, "maybe try actually listening." And with that, I walked out the door strong, free, and completely untouchable.